Tetremanina, Mikase Uyura, Mitri for Jesus, Empire what's here for Jesus, me free makumemu, Mikase Uyura. Body, Etiamakani, Namami, Unkutona will say, Aye, Midimi Muni, Namao, Ejonyami, Wadu, Doso. Wadom nonti min suma sebi ejonyami musumo mami mi free makume mi shewe yunya. Ejonyami, wadom doso, wadom nonti, minsuma sebi. Ejonyami, wosomo mami.
Please, we will humbly ask our volunteers to help bring everyone to the auditorium. Volunteers, help us bring everyone to the auditorium. We are hard pressed for time.
Jesus, oh yeah, Jesus, a body in error, Jesus, Tetramanina, Ekase Uyura, Mitri for Jesus, Empire Botier for Jesus, me free makumemu, me kase uyura. Eye wuna watomia body, wechia makani na mami, wokutona wuse ayeyi, midimi wuni na mawo. Ejonyami, wadom doso, wadom nonti, minso masebi. Ejonyami, wosomo mami. Free makume, ishewe michewa, michewa potan kesi, min kwandanina, moso merate, nimakon, a queen, mi jaima wo. Inkwaji bi ewo umu ayerisabi wo umu enyimonyambi ewo umu Emmanuel Ashemi bode Ekami mudanyina Michua Michirabotan Kesi Minkondanyina Maso merade Inyimoko Inti okwi Mijai mawo Inkwaji ewo umu ayerisabi wo umu enyumonyambi ewo umu Emmanuel asochibu denara se wumi otu delara ma bravo imo yemi min suroji na mi rinsa minyami ida denara se wumi otu denara woman bravo imo min suroshi na mi rinsa minyami ida Ashemi bode Ekami mudanyina Michua Michirabotan Kese Minkondanyina Maso merade Enyimoko Inti okwi Mijai mawo Inkwajibi ewo umu ayerisabi wo umu enyimonyambi ewo umu Emmanuel Inkwajibi ewo umu ayerisabi wo umu enyimonyambi wo umu Emmanuel
God bless you, Reverend Joe Beecham. We'll invite the Voice of Pentecost to give us one song. Before they come, we have representatives of the Progressive People's Party, led by their National Secretary. Let me get the name right. And then they are Ashanti and Central Regional Executives. So their National Secretary is Remy Parker Edmondson. He leads the Progressive People's Party. And the national, is the National Secretary, and the Ashanti and Regional Secretariat are also here. We also have Dr. Treme Etuahene, Director General of the Ghana AIDS Commission is also here. Dr. Etuahine, you are welcome. Voice of Pentecost, one song. Of the brochure, Oman Ghana Batu Erusinjum, number 8, page 27 of the brochure. You can refer to that. Please. Yes. Thank you very much, Voice of Pentecost. Brothers and sisters, it's time to listen to a talk on building public support towards mobilizing resources domestically for development. And to do this for us, we have Dr. Maxwell Opoku Afari, the first Deputy Governor of the Bank of Ghana. Hallelujah.
Dr. Maxwell Opoku Afari is speaker at the National Development Conference. He is a distinguished economist and policymaker. He brings over 2 decades of experience in central banking and international finance to his role, having held senior positions at both the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the Bank of Ghana. Dr. Opoku Afari worked at the IMF for nearly a decade, where he rose to Deputy Division Chief and Mission Chief. He also participated in IMF negotiations with several African and Caribbean countries. He has published extensively on monetary policy, inclusive growth, among others, in low-income countries. Before his tenure at the IMF, Dr. Opoku Afari worked for 13 years at the Bank of Ghana. He was also a member of the Ghana government's Capital Markets Committee. Dr. Opoku Afari holds a first degree in economics and statistics, an MPhil in economics from University of Ghana, Legon, and a PhD in economics from the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom. Dr. Opoku Afari currently serves as the first Deputy Governor of the Bank of Ghana. He serves as a member of many agencies and committees of the Government of Ghana that deal with financial policy and management. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Maxwell Opoku Afari.
Apostle Chairman and the executives of the Church of Pentecost. I feel very privileged to be here and to speak at this very important conference. I have a very difficult job to do. But I think that the building blocks have been built already. And the timing for my intervention is appropriate. Because if you listen to the different segments that have come in, without them, what I'm going to talk about will not happen. If we don't change the way we think, if we don't begin to believe in ourselves, if we don't change our attitude, if we don't realize that we are part of the democratic process, if we don't change all that, then building the support to mobilize resources for development is not going to happen. So I'm really pleased and glad that those who spoke before me have helped to lay the foundation. And on that, I think I'm going to have something to put out there. I'm coming from a point where it's going to be a little bit technical, but I'll try to make it simple and break it down for us to understand. So for that reason, I'll try to stick to the script, and where I need to elaborate, I will try to elaborate. But my topic for today, Apostle Chairman, is on building public support towards mobilizing resources domestically for development. This topic is timely and appropriate. For those who recall, I had a public lecture in September 2021, and I spoke on the topic, Rethinking Development Financing, Macroeconomic Management When the Love is Gone. I touched on this issue that I'm going to talk about and made the case that once the love from our development partners appear to have shifted to a different direction, the financing of development in such economies like Ghana will shift from our development partners to raising resources domestically to finance our development. In my remarks today, I will argue that the love from our development partners has shifted in a different direction. But government revenue, on the other hand, has consistently underperformed, forcing successive governments in the last couple of years to seek funding from the international capital markets to close the financing gap for development. However, funding from the international capital markets has become unsustainable, as evidenced by recent crises that culminated in the decision by the government to seek IMF support. Therefore, the time has come for Ghanaians to step forward to support government to implement difficult but necessary measures to boost revenue generation, prioritize our own expenditure towards investments in productive infrastructure and human capital development to secure the future for our children and the next generation. It is also time for those of us privileged to be in public office to demonstrate integrity and a commitment to solving real problems that impede the progress of our people. I'm therefore encouraged that the Church of Pentecost has taken this very important step of providing a forum to discuss issues on national development. And I'm very proud of that because I'm also a member of the church and I'm also an elder of the church. So I want to begin to ask certain questions. My first question is, why is domestic resource mobilization critical for Ghana's development? You see, I started by saying that because domestic revenue has underperformed, successive governments have resorted to borrowing from abroad to finance our own development. But the question is, should we depend on borrowing from abroad? I'll be making the case down the line. Or should we look internally to finance our own development? I think that is important. We are in a program organized by the church, so it is important that we understand this very well. I want us to read Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. The Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7 says that the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is a slave of the lender. This is in the Bible. It said the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a slave, is a servant to the lender. So if we have resorted to borrowing from abroad to develop ourselves, then we are servants to those who are lending to us. And I will demonstrate why that is so and what happened in 2022. So my question again is, why is domestic resource mobilization critical for Ghana's development? Let me take us back to those of us who are old enough to understand terms like structural adjustment program. I think those who understand what it means. But in the early 1980s, majority of sub-Saharan African countries faced dire economic challenges driven by high fiscal and current account deficits, rising inflation, slow growth, and weak currencies. These were caused by both domestic economic mismanagement, poor governance, and external shocks such as the fall in commodity prices, oil price increases sharply. These economic imbalances worsen living standards, widen the inequality gap, and increase poverty levels among our people. The Bretton Woods institutions, when we say the Bretton Woods institutions, we are talking about IMF and the World Bank, packaged what was later termed as Economic Recovery Program and the Structural Adjustment Program to address the economic imbalances, restore macroeconomic stability, and support economic growth. Ghana signed on to the programs and became a star performer of the Economic Recovery Program and Structural Adjustment Program. And as a result, we started getting a lot of money from our development partners. And if you are following recent developments, this is the 17th time Ghana has signed on to the program with the IMF. So we are star performers, going back all the time, depending on resources from them to develop our country. Technically, the official development assistance, which is another word of funds from our development partners, was a major source of medium to long-term financing from our bilateral and multilateral sources, intended to support infrastructure and human capital development, and sometimes used as balance of payment support. As the Ghanaian economy regains some level of stability, Such investment in infrastructure and human capital provided incentives for private sector development and therefore played a catalytic role in promoting private sector-led economic growth and poverty reduction. At the peak in 2004, when we were under these programs, Ghana received about 16% of our GDP from donors, from outside. 16% of our GDP came from outside. Then when Ghana graduated to become a lower middle income country, this 16% reduced. So they all disappeared. And it went as low as 1.5% of GDP coming from outside. So we were depending on the 16% of our GDP coming from our donors to help to develop the country. Then after 2004 and somewhere around 2007, when we became a middle-income country, a lower middle-income country, the development partners said, if you are a lower middle-income country, then we want to shift our focus to help those who are developing and poor, lower-income countries. So we are not bringing resources to you again. So the 16% dropped to 1.5%. This is what I mean by when the love is gone. So the love that we had after being a star performance from the structural adjustment program went away, so the resources also dwindled. From 16%, it's a large amount of money, it went to 1.5%. Then what happened? Whilst that went down, our domestic revenue also underperformed. You realize that the donors were giving us 16% of GDP. It disappeared, it went to 1.5%. Then let's look at what we were able to mobilize internally. As at 2022, we were mobilizing on average 12.7% of GDP domestically. So we are not even able to mobilize enough to equate what the donors were giving us. What we're able to collect amongst ourselves in terms of taxes account for about 12.7% of GDP. Whereas when we're depending on the donors, they were giving us 16% of GDP. So clearly you can see that a lot, and when they were giving us 16% of GDP, we were adding that to what we were collecting domestically to have enough resources to develop. That 16% is gone, and we are able to collect only up to 12% of GDP. That is where the problem is coming from. That is where our development finance problem is coming from as a country. If we are not able to mobilize the resources domestically and we continue to depend on donors, then we become servants to those who are lending to us. 12.7% of GDP is what we take. Let me give you examples of what our neighbors are collecting. Burkina Faso is collecting almost 17% of GDP. Togo is collecting almost 16% of GDP. South Africa is collecting 26% of GDP to develop their country. And that's why some of us move from here to go to South Africa. The people there are collecting the resources domestically to develop their country, and we are moving to that place because we are seeing what is happening there. Morocco is collecting 28% of GDP. Tunisia, 29% of GDP. Ghana is taking 12% of GDP. That's what we are collecting. That's all that is available to develop our country, 12% of our GDP. We are even nowhere near our immediate neighbors and nowhere near the emerging markets and the middle-income countries, which is South Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Kenya, and the rest. They are way ahead, and we are still around 12% of GDP. So then, that is a huge gap. This is what is coming into the government to spend. Meanwhile, the National Development NDPC is estimating that on average, annually, we need $37.9 billion every year to close our rising infrastructure gap. Everybody wants a bridge, everybody wants a road, hospitals, schools, everything that we want. If we want to meet all those needs, we need to raise about $38 billion every year between now and 2047 to be able to provide these resources. So if you are a government and you are in power and you are able to collect 12% from the citizens, but your expenditure is close to 30% of GDP, how do you finance the difference? Where is it coming from? You have to depend on what? Donors. Meanwhile, the donors are saying that you have moved. You are now a lower middle income country, so they've shifted their focus. They can only give you 1.5%. So the government had no option than to go to the international capital markets to borrow, to close the gap, to borrow commercially, paying commercial interest rate to come and help to close the gap, to provide electricity, to provide water, to provide health care, to provide bridges, to provide roads, to fix roads, and sometimes we even borrow to pay ourselves. Let me give you another example. The total revenue we collect every year or every month, if we collect total revenue from taxes and other resources, we use 95% of that to pay previous debts that we owe and a little bit of our salary for public sector workers. You have already borrowed in the past, so you have to always pay your debt. So if you add what we pay as debt, interest payment and amortization, and when we pay that, we don't have enough to pay our public sector workers, which means government has to borrow to top up, to pay public sector workers, and to fix your road, and to provide electricity, because people are not paying for electricity. We heard the vice president speaking about it yesterday, and to provide other things. When we continue like that, where do we end? So is it any strange or any surprise that we had a debt crisis in 2022? It is coming right from our inability to raise resources domestically. Prof was speaking and said that we have more than enough here to take care of ourselves. So if we do have more than enough here to take care of ourselves, why are we not able to raise the resources here, as other countries are doing, to be able to provide for our needs? Why should we continue to borrow and create debt for ourselves? Between 2011 and 2021, Ghana had borrowed $15.5 billion from the international capital market. $15.5 billion. And remember, anytime we borrow, you and I and our children and the future generation are the ones going to pay. Between 2007, that's the first time we accessed the international capital markets, was 2007. Between 2007 and 2021, we had borrowed $15.5 billion from the international capital markets, from abroad, to close this gap I'm talking about. And when we borrow in dollars, we generate resources what? In cedis. And we need to use that cedis to pay the dollars. So economists have found a nice way to call that the original sin. The moment you begin to do that, you are committing what we call the original sin. You go out there to borrow in dollars, bring it here, spend and generate resources in cedis, and then you have to go and pay them back in dollars. When you have that original sin, and then your currency depreciates, assuming you borrowed $100 million, you brought it into cedis. At that time, it was 5 cedis to a dollar. It's 500 million Ghana cedis, right? Now, by the time you are paying them, your currency has depreciated. It's now 10 cedis to the dollar. You need to mobilize 1 billion Ghana cedis to go and pay the same debt. So you are mobilizing twice the amount you use to pay the same debt. And interest rate hasn't come. This is just from exchange rate depreciation. So I'm just trying to let you understand where we are and what the problem is. and why it is important that as citizens we must work together with government to raise domestic resources. By November 2022, in 2022 alone, the depreciation in the cedi added $200 million to our debt without doing anything. As the money is sitting down there, you have added 200 million cedis to it as debt owed. So as the currency moves, you are adding to your debt. That is the original sin. And that is what we keep on committing all the time. Now, even if you're able to borrow from the international capital markets, you will say that, oh, there is a green light. But there comes a time when even the international capital markets will say that we won't be able to lend to you. So in 2022, they have what they call the rating agencies. And these rating agencies looked at Ghana emerging out of the COVID and the challenges that we had, and they didn't think that in their assessment, the economy is viable. So because of that, they downgraded us. You must have a certain rating to be able to even borrow from the international capital markets. But because of that, they downgraded us. And the moment they downgraded us, the economy started spiraling, going down. This is where the point I made about Proverbs 22, verse 7 comes in. The lender, with the agencies that work with the lender, sat down and decided that we need to move Ghana's rating to what they call junk rating, meaning you are not capable of paying your debt. And they know the consequences of doing that. Because every year, we were borrowing $3 billion from the international capital markets to add to our domestic resources. The moment they downgraded us, we could not borrow that $3 billion. And the moment we could not borrow that $3 billion, the country came to a halt. That's when the crisis intensified. That's when those who need exchange rate said that we are not going to have $3 billion US coming in. Then where are we going to get exchange rate for our imports and to pay other things? So then there was a rush to buy foreign currency, and then we started seeing the currency depreciating from around 6. It went all the way to close to 15. It is because it was triggered by this action. So you become what? A servant to the lender if you continue to depend and borrow from other people. This is a strong case for us as a country to focus on raising the resources domestically. We need to work domestically to raise the resources. But then the question is, why is it that our neighbors, our peers, those in other middle-income countries, emerging economies, are able to raise domestic resources, and why is Ghana not performing at the same level? That comes with the topic for today. How should we build public support towards mobilizing resources domestically for development? Because from what I have painted so far, Ghana cannot continue to develop with that arrangement. Ghana cannot continue to develop with that arrangement. It is for this reason that the president made a strong call about Ghana beyond aid. We need to begin to see Ghana beyond this. We need to begin to see Ghana depending on domestic resources to develop our country. And the resources are here. People come into this country and make the money and take it out. The resources are in the country. We need to be able to mobilize it. We need to be able to mobilize those resources to develop our country. Mr. Chairman, I want to touch on a number of issues. And the first one I want to touch on is that whilst the love from the development partners has shifted and domestic revenues have consistently underperformed, we need to focus on how we can mobilize support to raise domestic revenue. Whilst this is happening, the infrastructure gap is also rising, and the external sources for funding them have become very costly and unpredictable. In the face of these challenges, it has become necessary that we bind together and solve the deep-rooted challenges of our time, such as access to water, healthcare, education, sanitation, and eradication of poverty, among others. The natural question is, how do we do this? In what follows, I will share some thoughts on steps to take to build public trust for national programs. In particular, I will highlight 5 areas that require urgent attention. These include promoting effective leadership in public service, which has been touched on by previous speakers. The next one is building trust between the general public and the government. And here we're talking about having what we call a social contract between the government and the public. The next one is enhancing public expenditure management. The third one is improving tax administration. And then the next one is promoting inclusive growth to create jobs and leverage our demographic dividend. You see, we are not talking about promoting just growth. Inclusive growth, meaning broad-based, everybody must participate from that growth. So let me touch on the first one, building effective or promotive effective leadership in public service. In the interest of time and because previous speakers have touched on this extensively, I want to defer this because we've heard a lot about that and we've heard so many from Prof. And from Dr. Olivia and all those others who spoke about effective leadership in public service. So I want to move to the next one, which is building trust between government and the general public, touching on social contract. One of the challenges confronting domestic resource mobilization is the lack of trust between the general public and the policymakers. This trust deficit can be attributed to several factors, including increase in the perception of corruption among public office holders, the lack of participation in the democratic governance, lack of transparency and accountability in governance, and broken promises of politicians. Closing this trust deficit will require strengthening the fight against corruption. This may take the form of resourcing state institutions such as IOCO, Office of the Special Prosecutor, SHRAG, among others, to fight against corruption and enhance accountability. Government should also strengthen the existing asset declaration system to hold public office holders accountable for their stewardship. Apostle Chairman, we can also rebuild trust in government by encouraging citizens' participation in the governance process. This can be done through several ways. First, the occasional government town hall meetings that were held in recent past to explain government programs to the electorate and also to take questions from the general public should be continued to deepen citizen participation in the governance process and build trust for national development. Also, the decentralization of government functions to the regions and the districts should be strengthened to enhance access to government services across the country. Participatory democracy can increase the knowledge of the general public about the benefits of government programs and activities and make them more likely to contribute their share to national development. Mr. Chairman, there is also the need to promote transparency and accountability in government. Without transparency and accountability, trust will be lacking. It is important to note that the government has agreed under the IMF program to reinforce public procurement transparency by rolling out the e-procurement system and its integration with the GIFME system. Also, the transparency of procurement will be strengthened by facilitating access to beneficial ownership of information of companies awarded public procurement contracts. We need to know who is behind the companies that get the contracts. On the other hand, public office holders or politicians should learn to make promises that they can keep when voted into office. The electorate should view such promises and when they make the promises, the electorate should view such promises as a social contract between them and the government and the politicians, and such a contract must be fulfilled. Therefore, failure to keep such promises breaks the bond of trust between the general public and politicians, thereby making it difficult to court their support for government programs. So when we make promises and we don't meet them, we break the trust. And when the trust is broken, and I come and ask you to raise more resources, you will not do it. So we must make promises we can keep, and that will help us to build trust, and that trust will help us to be able to get the public to support government programs. Mr. Chairman, the next one I want to touch on is enhancing public expenditure management. There is the need to enhance efficiency of public spending to reduce waste. The chronic fiscal slippages that we've had and the debt burden that I talked about. We therefore need to identify and eliminate areas where spending is either wasteful, inefficient, or does not deliver value for money. Also, negotiation of government projects and contracts must be effectively handled and scrutinized to ensure that losses are minimized. Efficiency in public spending is also important because the level of tax compliance, when people are willing to pay taxes, is tied to the effective use of the resources or the taxes they've paid already. So the more people are willing to pay is when we're able to demonstrate to them how we have used the resources they've given to us. When citizens perceive that the tax system does not inure to their benefits, they are likely to evade or not comply with such a tax obligation. But where tax revenues are used to finance productive spending programs, taxpayers are more likely to accept their tax obligation. Therefore, conscious efforts are needed to ensure that we stamp out misapplication in the management of the public purse, not only through punitive actions, but also by implementing recovery measures to ensure that the public purse is protected. The Auditor General has started some work in this area, and the government has agreed under the IMF program to further enhance the efficiency of government spending. Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to improving tax administration in Ghana. We need to help to raise the tax to GDP ratio from the 12% to 18-20%, at least in the medium term, and then think of moving that to the 26% of our peers. But at least our first target should be getting close to the neighbors around us, right? We are in the same environment. They are around 17, 18, and we are 12. That is not enough. And we should work towards doing that. And I think that the recent introduction of the Ghana card means that we have now data on more employees and entities that fall within the tax bracket. It is therefore up to the Ghana Revenue Authority, of which I am a board member, to reach out and bring all these potential taxpayers into the tax net. As more people and entities are enrolled to pay taxes, the per capita tax burden, meaning the tax that each of us pays, could be reduced through elimination of nuisance taxes, while raising the tax to GDP ratio from a larger base. Once you have more people paying taxes, then the tax that each person pays can come down so that we get more people to contribute to raise the taxes. Then the one area that is a low-hanging fruit that successive governments have struggled to work on, but other countries have tapped into that to raise revenue, is property tax collection. Property tax collection. There's no jurisdiction in the world where you own a property and you don't pay tax on that property. Everywhere. And that's where jurisdictions like Mauritius, Tanzania, and other countries worked on to be able to raise property taxes for the municipalities to be able to fix the rules in the municipalities. As Dr. Olivia spoke, it is not for the parliamentarians to fix rules in the municipalities. It's the municipal authorities to raise these resources on the properties in their municipalities to be able to fix the rules, to be able to develop the specific municipalities. According to a recent OECD report, taxes on property as a percent of GDP in Ghana is just 0.3, not even 1%, 0.3. In Asia, it's over 5%. In the other advanced economies and other jurisdictions in Africa, it's over 1%. In Ghana, it's 0.3%, less than 1%.